Okay, I've got a new troll, and I haven't had one for a while, so I thought I'd do a video about this, especially how ironic it is. It's on a video I had already made a few years back that maybe you should look into, called Clarence E. Debunks Afrocentric Therapeutic Lies, and it was back in 2023. But I had set up to do this about a year and a half before and lost all my crap and couldn't find the piece that I went off of. Anyhow, regardless, I ended up making it then. And so this guy comes on, and he's, of course, very self-exposing. It's this easy to hook a fish. He had to comment, his name is Ahmad Ahmed 214. He says, that's a lie. And I go, what's a lie? Claims of the Afrocentric loons on parade, yes, we all agree. Because all the comments down below, and please visit the video and take a look at it, see the comments of the people below, and see that we're all pretty much in agreement. And let me start this off also by saying the fatigue is real. And black people see it, and everybody's really noticing it, but it's getting worse and worse. It's well, and it won't get exposed by the media at all. There was a time where that would happen occasionally to try to quell it, but it anyhow, the fatigue is real. So let's just look at what he says here. In fact, what I'm going to try to do without commenting, if I can, I'm going to read his whole statement and then go back through it and dissect it. He says, the answer to what's a lie, he goes, now watch the reach. I guess let me preset this here. Watch the reach of out of sub-Saharan Africa they desperately try so hard to do. And they try to claim the origin, and we was the origin of everything. Now the comedy in all of this, overshadowing it all, is the fact that he's on a video showing Clarence E. Walker, a black man, who ends up claiming that they're all therapeutic lies, all the Afrocentrism is a joke, and that they're claiming it all because they feel like they're competing somehow, and they can't realize how pathetic it looks. And so they're therapeutically trying to make themselves feel better by claiming any and everybody but themselves. And I did a video on it, and he's on there, well, that's a lie. He starts off and goes through a tirade of crap here. Let's just try to get through it in one run, and then I'll go back through it. About the Sumerians. No European knows where these people came from. And if they came anywhere, it would Africa, it's period. What? Yeah, he left something out. It's a grammar problem, usually frontal cortex, the whole idea. About the Sumerians, no European knows where these people came from, and if they came from anywhere, it would be Africa, period. I don't know where "it's" comes in at, and it doesn't have to be there for the first part of the next part. But he's worrying about the Sumerians, and of course they can't be endemic Caucasians of the area that have been there for many tens of thousands of years, but they have to somehow be sub-Saharans. And I've done the videos debunking the fact that we was the Egyptians. Repeatedly, and we were the Moors. And what else have they claimed? Well, Sumerians, Persians, Minoans, anybody that we was everybody, original Chinese, and so on. Let's just try to get through this. Tablets found in southern Africa prove this. The Chaldees was an African kingdom. their king from Ethiopia today back to their land and named Elam and his people the Elamites. Mark that. The Nubian kingdom stretched all the way to West Asia. Oh, mark that. Also, the Sahara was advanced than those parts. Oh, mark that. People forget the Grimaldis, Anu, Hottentots all came from Africa. These groups went out to the world and first inhabited Asia before any other people or groups. Africans were in India 54,000 years. Not even Europeans existed, not Chinese. Mark that. Also, thin symbols are the oldest form of communication, and the first one and oldest is only found in Africa. Mark that. Thin symbols are the mother of Medu Necher, which he spells wrong, and writings. Mark that. Everything in Tamari, modern day Egypt, came from Africans. Mark that. People are just looking at the word, quote, Afrocentric, close quotes, without looking at the evidence. Mark that. Also, Egypt was not built in 3000 BC, is actually older than Mesopotamia. Not a complete sentence at the end or even a comma, but that is a whole lot to digest. And we're going to find that it's exactly the opposite of everything they try to claim. Not just that, but he's also on a video explaining that these people try to make up crap, make themselves feel better, and examples are given that is just what this guy is doing. And then he jumps in and goes, here's your example. So this Ahmad 214 said, about the Sumerians, no European knows where these people came from, and if they came from anywhere, it would be Africa. Well, if you want to believe the modern trope that we have, we all come from Africa. In fact, Africa was named by and for endemic Caucasians of North Africa, the Afar tribe and the Afiri. So, Africa was named after endemic Caucasians. But before it was all called Libya, and that's also named after endemic North African Caucasians. So, one way or another, backflow, flip back and forth, we're all Africans if we go under the modern theory, but a lot of things recently have shown that it's really probably an in and out of Africa, because a lot of finds like Gracopithecus freibergi and Oranopithecus macedoniensis and a few others that are more modern looking than a sub-Saharan sample like Lucy and those things that predate them by millions of years, said it might have gone this way and had a mixing. But also one key point of that is that there are different species in different places that have changed over the millions of years to be radically different than each other and end up being actually not closely related to each other. Genetics has formed this out and shown it to be true. So he goes on, by the way. Tablets found in southern Africa prove this. I wonder what tablets he's attempting to talk about, but I don't know what he could be referring to. He goes on and stretches his arm across the Fertile Crescent through Asia, named by Caucasians, into ancient Sumeria, and says the Ur of the Chaldees was an African kingdom, their king from Ethiopia today, back to their land and named Elam and his people the Elamites. Sorry, that one choked me up there a little bit. There are other Chaldees are known to be the Sumerian prince kings and so on, and they're all shown with blue eyes in most depictions, ones that they inset the eyes with, and this shows that the ancient Sumerians were a blue-eyed Caucasian people living there. That and the phenotype that they have for them, and of course all archaeology, anthropology, and genetics now have pretty much done it. But the problem with genetics is they're not looking at the ancient Sumerians like the Puabi lady was and a few others, and that's because there's a phenotypical difference between the people that were considered the priest kings and the nobility, if you will, and so on, than a lot of the common people. And those common people are more closely related to the current population than the elders were. And strangely, they said, and so did the Egyptians, in identical statements, which shows a connective also, but they said that we rule over the dark-haired people. And that means a lot, but people maybe don't even think sometimes that we would also say, well, we rule over the dark-haired people. Well, what color is your hair? And genetics shows that the answer to that is a people that had not just dark hair, but brown hair and lighter and auburn hair and even blonde and redheads. But their king from Ethiopia today, back to their land named the Elamites. The Elamites are an ancient Caucasian people that lived on the other side of Sumer. A lot of people listening to me may not even know what the Near and Middle East is all composed of, and they know pretty much around the Mediterranean because of the Gaza Strip and all the trouble happening, and here's the Nile coming up here right after you cut the corner of the Mediterranean. But the Fertile Crescent hooks over into Sumer, and then there's the Elamites on the other side of it, and the Zagros Mountains. And there's been finds there too, and of course all connectives are for Caucasian type people and people that somewhat directly derived out of Cro-Magnon in its vibration. But we'll get into that more in a minute. But Ethiopia, I've said this in a few videos, and I'm going to waste a few minutes saying it here again. The Ethiopians of the ancient Greeks in mythology and everything, up until the time of Herodotus, which is right around 400 BC, all up until then, in all their tales that we still all have today, weren't a people living in southern Africa near the Horn were named that. In fact, they didn't adopt that name till the 1940s. They were known as Abyssinia, on the edge of the abyss of the Sahara in an unknown place. And you look at old maps and it'll show you they don't even know sub-Saharan Africa exists. And whenever the Phoenicians went around it, they had to go around the Cape and the point at the southern tip of Africa, and they said they went past the equator and the sun was on the other side of the ship, and the Greeks didn't want to believe it. But regardless of that, before those times, Ethiopians were known as a people that lived nowhere near southern Africa. They lived at the far east and the far west of the known world where the sun rises and sets. And they had a belief, because, whenever you see the sun set, how it gets a little bit bigger due to the lensing magnification of our atmosphere. So sunsets are a little bit bigger than what the sun looks like at noon. Okay, so they thought that it went into the sea and came up out of the east and land of the rising sun. Everybody knows this. And so they thought they got sunburned by being closer to the sun, because they found people living north versus people living south and closer to the equator or closer to the sun and its band of where it goes across, mainly in between the Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer, and the winter and summer idea. And whenever it's summer in the northern hemisphere, it's winter in the southern hemisphere, and flip-flops back and forth. But regardless, that's all, of course, Caucasian science and derivatives and understanding the world that we live in today. But Ethiopia was never a sub-Saharan or a Negroid type of people in any way, shape, or form. In fact, Ethiopian people today are a mixture of people that, in exactly the opposite of what he says here about the Elamites, makes connections to who admixed the Ethiopians, along with the Arabic type people and so on. And Egyptologist 7 did a good video about each little group over there, and including them, showing what their major genetic pattern is, but also that they had been admixed a long time ago. But they aren't related to the Congoids, that are people like this usually, even though he's adopted this other name, which makes connectives to Islamic slave trade, and getting a name from that. So Ethiopians, the Greeks went to see these Ethiopians in the far east and far west, so they went to the far west of North Africa and to look for these Ethiopians, which means sunburned-faced people, because they could get tans, sunburns, and so on. And blacks, especially Afrocentrics, were real proud of the fact that they have a melanin to where they don't actually get sunburnt, but they can get sunburned if they haven't been around the sun for a long time, and then get a extreme exposure, and then it peels. But anyhow, and all they found whenever they went looking for these Ethiopians of mythology were a pale Caucasian people living in North Africa, far northwest Africa. And so, where we think of Morocco and Fez and places like this near Gibraltar. And this was the ancient Berbers they ran into that were the endemic Caucasians there, that actually became the Moors when taken over by Islam and turned the other way. But you can look at ancient Moorish artwork done by themselves and see who they were, regardless of the claims. Anyhow, irregardless, so they had to make a new word for these people because they weren't sunburned faced. So they called them Leuco-Ethiops, which means white Ethiopians, because sure, they had tans and stuff, but they were not people that were sunburnt. But then, by finding that out, Herodotus was like, where are these people? Because the ancient maps show them in ancient India and so on. And of course, that makes connective to the Aryans of India, the light-skinned people, versus the dark-skinned people that are below them, and the Danius or whatever. So, and that was pretty much the stretch of the known world at that time. So Ethiopia has no even real connection to the truth of ancient Ethiopia, or whenever it talks about it in the Bible and so on, that Ethiopia at that time was known to be different, totally. At the far east and far west of the known world, where the sun rises and sets, it says that exact statement repeatedly in ancient Greek. And again, until they found out that, well, they're not here, well, where are they? And somebody said, but Herodotus never saw these people, that above the Nile, above Egypt, not Egyptians, were these people that had sunburnt faced appearance that looked like Caucasians with sunburn, with extreme sun. Well, there's a lot of people that have a olive type skin, and they can get extreme tans. But also, if you look at their butt because it's always covered, or their legs, wham, they're just tanned real good. Olive skin is not really a dark skin. Let's continue with what he went off on, though. But that pretty much ends the Ethiopian idea, but also in the fact that he talks about the Elamites and stuff coming in. Recently, in E7 did a video about it, that they found genetics coming into ancient Egypt, like I had talked about repeatedly on my channel, that actually had a Sumerian connection with his genetics and everything, signatures. And so it looks like a pre-Proto-Egyptian type people had actually come in and mixed with the ancient Egyptians. And I've made many connections showing you artifacts like the Gebel Arak knife and just all kinds of things, and discussing similarities with cuneiform, with ideographic writing, with winged sun discs. It just multiplies. And when I first started talking about this, they had a paragraph, then it grew a little bit, and then now it got its own page where they show you they know there are these connections, and I'm sure the genetic finding on this will become an attachment to that page shortly. But there are no sub-Saharans out of sub-Saharan Africa. So all this is just a therapeutic thing, just like the video was about in the first place. He's like, here, let me self-expose. The Nubian kingdom stretched all the way to West Asia. Well, no, that's not true. The Nubians never made it past the Egyptians. In fact, there was an edict that they couldn't come through Egypt, and there was a price on their heads for most of on and off. And there was a price on their head that was worth more than a live one. And they actually had this thing where you didn't have to bring and drag the body all the way back here. We don't even want that. You just chop off the right hand of a sub-Saharan that is encroaching on our land, and we'll give you more than a live one. This is proven over and over in documents. So it's amazing what people avoid in a modern day to talk about when they talk about Egyptians and Nubian connections, when they try to say, oh, they were just friends with everybody. No, they domesticated them. They ended up being the viceroys of Kush, and ruled over them a long time. Look up viceroys of Kush, you'll see it. I've got videos on it. It shows you the reigns and everything, and also if you read carefully, it tells you these are the people that probably took over in the 25th dynasty. The admix people that they had already taken over control with. But this is a much later thing. This has been going on with the Nubians, but people act like they're there forever. They ended up showing in a land that the Egyptians called Nubia, where they used to acquire their gold. Farther up the cataracts, and because of that, quite an adventure to go, but that's where they would get their gold, and that's in fact what Nubia means. And they didn't call the Nubians as we do today. They called them Nehasu, which still means worthless to this day in ancient Egyptian Coptic, which is still a language there. And they also called them vile and wretched and troglodytes. And troglodytes sounds like pretty much what its definition is primitive, unaware cave or hole dwellers. Unaware. So whenever they try to make connections, the Nubians were the Egyptians, it's like they're exactly the opposite of what they say every time. It was the connection in the ancient world between two races of people that only had that connection, by the way. And the Congoids that keep trying to make these claims actually didn't even know Egypt ever existed, and also aren't related directly to them or the people between them, known as the Khoisan, that have that click language that people are familiar with, that are totally different also. In fact, Congoids themselves aren't homogeneous, and they ended up capturing and selling their own people off to Islamic slave trade well before the transatlantic for hundreds of years. Was it over 900 years? But nobody cares about that because they won't pander to them. In fact, some of it still goes on to this day, and you still don't hear people try to say anything about that because it ruins the bullshit narrative that people try to push, which has become exhausting and fatiguing. So Nubia didn't have any connections to that. In fact, they show up in about the 5th dynasty, and there's Nubia A group before them, and the Nubia A colony was actually seen to be Caucasoids. And they've done genetics and archaeology and everything onto them, and Egyptologist 7 again has another video on this, and connections showing archaeology stating that no, the Nubian A colony wasn't even what we call Nubians today for sure, because they're radically different people. Nubian B colony shows up 400 years later, and they get decimated so bad they're not seen again for about another 400 or 500 years. And then you have these connections and these edicts that are written by the Egyptians saying that they aren't allowed into Egypt by well-known decrees, and they give a boundary of Heh, which is way up by the first cataract, and they built forts there and things saying like, ye shall not pass. And they had sentries and guards. In fact, the ancient structure there, what's amazing about it that they had in Buto, looks like a castle. It even has that niched architecture on the top and so on too, that people could walk along and look for it in the distance to see if they could see anybody, and they sent out scouting raids all the time if they could find somebody, and quite often they did. But then he goes on and he says, and the Sahara was way advanced than those parts. And I'm guessing he's talking about Asia. But North Africa has always been far more advanced than Sub-Saharan Africa, even in its early addiction that we can see off of it. And of course it gets more and more advanced as you get out of Africa. And we can easily see that today. But in ancient times, it still was this same thing. And the toolkits of ancient people and stuff, early Homo sapiens, which goes over 325,000 years now, by the way, is more advanced than anybody's toolkits before. Let's just go on with what he tries to claim here. So the Sahara was not more advanced, and it'd be a real good idea if we could take that new SAR penetrating radar and have them fly across there and see what ruins we could find in what we call deepest Libya. In fact, it used to be called Libya, named after endemic Caucasians that have been there primordial for at least 30,000 years. Most archaeologists and anthropology will say, quite a few of them will just say over 60,000 years. In fact, in effect, always. But they don't like that reality either. He says people forget the Grimaldis, Anu, Hottentots, and they all came from Africa. These groups went out to the world and first inhabited Asia before any other people or groups. Now that's an odd claim, because you're saying that they came past Caucasians, but you're agreeing that Caucasians are in Africa somehow, and you went out first, nobody else. That all of archaeology showing hundreds of thousands of years, and even some failed attempts to go out and continue on, are people that got absorbed sometimes and no longer really exist, but they get found on through other people, like Neanderthals and their slight-eyed head mix that's in everyone, including North Africans and the ancient Egyptians, but not really sub-Saharan Africans. But whenever they looked at it closer, they found they do have some, and it looks like an exact representative of admix from people that did. Whoopsie, and genetics has shown that connection too. But Grimaldi's, I don't know if he's talking about Grimaldi man. That's an archaeological find that the area was swathed by Cro-Magnon man, which has now been renamed Early European Modern Humans, because once they did genetic testing over 30,000 BC, they found that haplogroup still exists today. And it probably goes back to 60,000 years or so, but we'll get into that later. But the weirdness here of Grimaldi man is that he was a more gracile, skinny, frail, small person. At this time, Cro-Magnon man was at least averaging over 5'9", I think, and the normal fluctuation there, and quite a few of them were exaggerated to a point they're like, what? Were 6'2", 6'3", in that range. Some getting up to 6'5", and even larger, but that's more in middle North Europe in the Altai Mountains in Cro-Magnon that had gotten to there and stuff, showing an even larger form, or the largest that they've found, if you will. But Cro-Magnon makes a swath across North Africa also, but not too many connections that go all the way to East Africa until much later, when they fibrate again, and then there's super migrations into all kinds of areas. Africans were in India 54,000 years, and not even Europeans existed, not Chinese. Why we mark that? Because Cro-Magnon man, who still exists today, was around at that time in the whole projected situation to, even though we found one that we call the earliest now, it's the earliest known, but where did they really start at? And of course, one day they might find one over 100,000 years old and be like, what? But at this point, it's just really 40,000 years old or so, and a little more. But at that point, 54,000 is what they project that he could easily be. And he says not even Europeans existed, which is strange because they've been renamed Early European Modern Humans from Cro-Magnon, because they still exist to this day. Yet, the problem is that these sub-Saharans, usually congruent forms like himself here, I may try to make comments. They're the ones that haven't been around very long in their modern form. They were, up until quite recently, in fact, strangely, it shows you that there isn't a linear progression of mankind. They were still a Homo erectus form, but a form that doesn't lead to any other people in humanity. They have up to 20% unknown ghost hominid DNA that no other creature on the planet has, therefore showing you that there's at least 20% in that. And I remember Afrocentrics like this guy saying, because we had Neanderthal and they didn't, they were the real humans somehow and stuff. But everybody in the world has it except for them. But when they found out they did anyhow, then usually they have a big cup of shut the fuck up about that. But then just say other lies if they can. Right now he's reaching all into Western Fertile Crescent, or Eastern Fertile Crescent area in the ancient Sumerians. So they have no connection to them whatsoever. In genetics, it's all archaeology. Everything, of course, points to this. But here's that, question of what they are. And so, if you're saying that they're Homo erectus, and there were migrations out of Homo erectus before, that anything that went out has no connection to you because of that ghost hominid DNA. And if they still have 20% left, imagine how much they were before these admix events, which the earliest seems to happen in the 30,000 BC range, and then another one right here about 4400 BC, and that makes Astellar Man. And Astellar Man at 4400 BC is the oldest modern form of a congoid that any archaeology has found. In fact, before that, there are small gray cell, somewhat like this thing I was talking about, football headed, small brained, Homo erectus type form. But anthropology doesn't want to talk about this usually. But I even have a video in one about ancient maritime that goes into 3 parts, and in the second I go into it, but I have it in 2 other videos where Chris Stringer, a well-known paleoanthropologist, comes out and shows that there's not a linear progression to mankind, that there were still these Homo erectus looking forms when way after there were modern forms of going on, and the earliest form of that was, of course, a Caucasian type of people. So it becomes exactly the opposite of what they try to claim. He claims it was Africans that were in India 54,000 years ago, but genetics says that even though there's a melanated people in South India, they weren't the sub-Saharans of today, and they weren't connected to them anyhow. They were just a melanated people. But you see black people trying to catch anybody with a tan, or even using red ochre art, and claim them. But they have no connections whatsoever. Also, Utean symbols are the oldest form of communication, and the first one and oldest is found only in Africa. Thentine symbols are the mother of Metu-Neter writings. Well, no, we find that ancient Sumeria predates Egypt with all these symbols and so on, and now maybe we'll make another connection, because they showed that in Egyptians they were using trade with urns and things, and they would wrap a cord around them and put this symbol on them, and that was basically for what city they were supposed to go to, because they had symbols with cities onto it. So that could be considered to be an early form of it, but that's actually after this event where the Sumerians, who already had ideographic writing or picture type writing over there. There are a couple of connections that go up to farther up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers up in that area from preemptive to that looks like it's proto ideographic writing. We don't need to get into that, but then again, that's where the ancient Sumerians came from. Who they act like they don't know, but we know now there's a lot of connections. And once we find Göbekli Tepe, it's almost easy to see where these people ended up going. The problem with Sumer is that they weren't really covered in usable stone like what's found in Egypt to do more stonework. But so what did they do? Well, they invented mud bricks. In fact, that's another connection to the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians, because adding straw to it in about this same amount and making the bricks about this size and everything, like in modern day we have this uniform idea of a brick, they had it going on first. We still use them to this day, brick houses. Yeah, man. So, it started off with the more primitive things and went up to the point of wooden houses, and now a hybrid form of that in stone and so on. But most sub-Saharans that are in non-colonized areas are still living in dung huts or mud huts to this day, even after trillions have been spent. But the writing of Egyptians and cuneiform, which makes connections exactly to the ancient Sumerians, it makes definite connections there and not to sub-Saharans, who didn't even have a writing of their own till the 1940s, and the writing in linguistics that they had before that had been given to them by the Islamic slave trade. He says everything in Tamari, modern day Egypt, came from Africans. Well, yes, the Caucasians of Egypt were endemic Caucasians living there, and of course Africa was named by and for endemic Caucasians. So yes, is everything from there, but everybody acts like everything in the world came from Egypt. But as we can really see all across the Caucasian world, there were inventions and different things that were picked up by other people and added to and mixed together like a soup, like I said in an ancient video, and ended up creating civilization. But it ended up creating the civilization that we have today. And it's a remarkable time in humanity where we're able to see people going into space. Finally, again, when I was a kid, I thought, well, by now we would have moon bases and more sky labs and all kinds of things for tourists to go to and people to hang out and check it out. They acted like we were going to, and this big space age, and they turned that off real quick. But now it's starting to get there again. But we're also in the computer age, and it's amazing in the last few hundred years what humanity has done. My grandfather remembers when the first car came into there, whenever they only had radio and then they had TV, whenever things like that happen. All these modern conveniences we have now are all brought to you by Caucasians, by the way. Some 99.7% of the inventions that are utilized today are invented by Caucasians or come directly from inventions, from ideas built on inventions that came from, and it keeps going back to. And you can take this all the way back to stick, and they were the first people that utilized that in a more special way. And even their ancient spear points and things from the earliest of times that we find were a more advanced toolkit. In fact, the one that jumped on the screen like a superhero all of a sudden out of nowhere were the Cro-Magnon man, and I did a video about it, and people actually explaining it. And I was waiting for somebody to talk shit about it because I took that directly from a dissertation from a PhD on exactly the subject. Anyhow, so writings come from Caucasian people, and Oriental people developed eventually a somewhat pictographic writing too. And there are connections because it looks a little like cuneiform, but it's done more differently on a different apparatus or style. But so out of the three groups of humanity that are going on here, there's this one that's really a primitive people left in the past, and they didn't do anything compared to others. So then they try to claim they were the others. And you can see this happening. In fact, this was on a video where it's being explained by a black man, the reason for this, and he self-exposes by jumping in and going, here's an example. It's sad, but silly. People are just looking at the word Afrocentric without looking at the evidence. No, everybody's looked at the evidence. It's called all anthropology, science, everything that anybody knows, and they realize that these were real primitive people. In fact, whenever they make things like this, it shows you their envy and jealousy of it, and they desperately want to claim anybody but themselves. I make videos showing this stretch of Caucasians, and of course, most of it's based on somebody who has found this information out and verified it to the point that you could see it. In fact, but whenever they make statements like these, it's exactly the opposite of what people do whenever they did verify it. You follow me? He also says Egypt was not built in 3000 BC, is actually older than Mesopotamia. So he ends off with something we've already discussed a little bit, but Mesopotamia goes back to about 5200 BC, but actually there's a primordial people that already have it going on. But at the point that their villages got all together and they got kicking to a certain point, that people in a modern day, in civilized society, woohoo, can look back and say this was pretty much, they had it all, everything all in there, was about 5200 BC. In fact, if you want to add the idea of writing to the point that we have it today, to write down any things and so on like that, which used to be a requiem for civilization, where you would have to have this going on, but they want to drop that out of it because quite often they try to talk about ancient African civilizations, and it wasn't a civilization at the time because they didn't have rewriting. How about that sad point? And again, they just developed writing in the 1940s off their own dialect, but they still used the Arabic or Phoenician type of script that we use today. So it's just something they developed eventually off of thousands of years of an example. It's not like they were a people like the Caucasians who came up with the language and everything that we know today, and the linguistics of the ancients all the way through, and all written history and everything we have all, well, some of us have gone through. Egypt was not built in 3000 BC. I don't know when you're talking about Egypt built. A lot of people peg that onto the Great Pyramids and stuff down in Cairo. And I guess that could make sense. It's like whenever they got really kicking. But they were kicking before then, but not before 3000 BC. But the flip side of that card is you can show that the Sphinx, or what the Sphinx originally came from, the lion body that's there, was actually a effigy of a person, but not in a Nemez headdress before that, and it got recarved. And that's the reason the head looks a little too small for the body, because it had already eroded a lot. And that erosion and the erosion around the Sphinx enclosure says that that thing could have been around a whole lot longer. And I think that it was as originality, but the Sphinx idea actually comes from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and the Greeks are known to have it and everything from the same reason and the same people, same type of what we would modern day call a Nordic type people. But of course those type of people were moving around quite a bit in the ancient world, and they wouldn't have necessarily been a Nordic. And then they eventually became the people of Western Eurasia, and well, of course in Russia and everything, but in variations. But Western Eurasians, what used to be called Proto-Indo-Europeans. But stepping back here to this Grimaldi's that he was talking about, that's a primordial finding of a people that's gracile. And at first they were like wondering, is this a hybrid or something of a sub-Saharan or something much more archaic, because they're not the same as these Cro-Magnons. It really helped stand Cro-Magnon out to be this incredible hero giant of what the hell, like a room full of football players, and all of a sudden you're like, man, these dudes are huge, that type of thing. So but you can easily look at it and tell that it has a Caucasian nasal sill, the whole idea. It's just a different form of people. And of course this is something like Cheddar Man, and they looked into it and got the genetics out of it and say, well, they don't have this SLC gene that we have in modern Europeans or far northern Europeans, and so they could have been olive skinned or whatever, and that is somehow over the time been twisted into they could be dark. They could be as dark as mahogany shoe polish, which by the way is off the scale of possibilities. And some of the scientists that were attached to that even came out denying it after the fact. They were like, somebody took the maximum and went all the way up on it, and it couldn't be like that. Like went all the way up on the maximum and then said, what if he tanned a whole lot and he was living right by the water and getting sun every day? How much could he, it's disgusting how they've, and that's been totally debunked. And of course they found a guy living just right near where they originally found that at, that is a direct relation, and he doesn't look like that at all. And of course all these Cheddarmen people, this is ancient West Europeans, AWE, and these people have all been found. They've got the genetics of a whole bunch of them, and none of them show this Cheddarman darkness or anything. There's no darkness gene, no over-melanated thing, nothing that would show that, but they wanted to roll it out, trying to make you feel better about all the immigration of people that want to be around you that come from countries. Anyhow, so Egypt was not built in 3000 BC. I don't know what you're referring to. The pyramids were 2495 or whatever, but that's the fourth dynasty, and of course the fourth dynasty shows these blue-eyed Egyptians again too, and all the way through those dynasties until the first intermediate period when everything kind of collapses for the first time, and then it re-cuts the Middle Kingdom and then collapses again and then comes back, and that's the New Kingdom and the big everything. Of course the big everything is either the pyramids or that, and some of the in-between stuff, and some of the in-between stuff got redone by others like Ramses the Great, and throws his name on it whenever it was actually built well before that by somebody else, and might have been refurbished by Ramses the Great. A lot of people know this. Anyhow, guys, this is the problem here, and the reason for the fatigue that I and E7 and a lot of these people have is, of course, been the wewas the Egyptians idea. But here you saw he was trying to claim we was Sumerians and Elamites. We were the ancient people over India and stuff. So it's a mental problem, and it's trying to mean to cope for something that they feel like they're lacking compared to the rest of humanity, and so they make up this therapeutic lies, like basically claiming they were black. Oh, this and that and everything. They were black. They keep trying to throw.
Please show us love by subscribing.
And when the sun was on it, you could see this little red tone and flickets coming out of it, but it was still not black, just dark brown. But that's considered dark-headed. Anyhow, guys, I thought this was a ironic thing I could easily make a video out of, because he's actually on a video showing you that what it is about Afrocentrics by a black man himself. That's just therapeutic, and they're trying to make up things to make themselves feel better. And then here we have this guy that says, let me show you an example. Duh. Let me know what y'all think down below. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. Peace.